had a little staff get together, and we just talked about some things that were on our hearts and minds. And one of the things that I challenged all of us to be doing was to be telling our stories. And I've mentioned that several times in the course of this year, the importance of telling stories on an individual or personal level. I say it to every one of you. Everybody here who knows the Lord has walked a little time with Jesus. Everybody has a story to tell. And I think it's real important that you often tell that story. That you tell it especially to family and friends and people. And that you share some things. You're going to find out when you do that it relates to other people's story. That other people find some similarities in it. They find some connections. And there's some interesting things in it. During that conversation we were having as a staff, I had in my mind this passage of Scripture in the book of Joshua, chapter 4. It's the story of the people of Israel as they're crossing the Jordan River into the Promised Land. They've been in the wilderness journeys now for 40 years. And Moses has died because he's not going to get to go into the Promised Land. Joshua's now in the lead, and they come to the river Jordan, and the Jordan is flooded and overflowing. But they're having a hard time getting across. And God tells them just would eat with the Ark of the Covenant, step out into the waters parted, and they walked across. But prior to that happening, in this chapter, God tells Joshua to get one man from each tribe and pick up a stone and put it in the middle of the river. When they get out there, to take those 12 stones, one for each tribe, and stack them, and they would be a memorial stone for the people of Israel forever. In verse 6 it says that this may be a sign among you, that when your children ask their fathers in time to come, saying, "What mean you by these stones?" What do these stones mean? Well, I had that in mind when I was sharing that with the folks. And one of the reasons it came into my mind is because these are my memorial stones. Several folks came in and asked me, "What's the rock talking about?" These are my memorial stones. I'm going to tell you the story behind each one of these rocks tonight. It may bore you to tears. I hope not. But I hope you can find a way to relate to it, because I think most of us can. And each one of these stones has a real important significance to me. All right? Now, if you look at these rocks, you think, well, there's not really anything special there. Those are just regular old rocks, and by and large, they are. If you go to Arkansas, by the way, Arkansas is often referred to as a rock hound's heaven. Because all kinds of rocks are there. There are all kinds of different kinds of minerals and different things. And these white rocks are very, very common in the central part of the state of Arkansas especially. And in a lot of them you find a lot of quartz and crystals and things of that nature are found in abundance in that area of the state of Arkansas. And when I was in high school, my mom and dad bought a little place up there. We moved back to Arkansas. We've been around the country some as Dad had pastored. And back just behind our home, back in the woods there, we came up on this rock one day, and it had these crystals sticking out of it. And one of my brothers picked it up. We hung on to it for years, and that's what's left of our home place in our minds. That's where that rock comes from. Most of you know something about my mother's story. My mother was an orphan. Her father died when she was 3 years of age. Her mother died when she was 1. Her mother was married on her first birthday. Okay? And so my mother was born on November the 3rd of 1932, and her mother was buried on November the 3rd of 1933. 1936, then, her father was buried in January of 1936. Her father had passed away and died. And all the years of our growing up, and it had happened to my mother, the Center Hill Church, which is out on Old Number 5 Highway, out east of Hot Springs, way out in the country there, that's where she grew up. Her grandparents took her in at the age of 4 and began to raise her and one of her other sisters. There were 4 little girls in the family. She was the youngest, and then my Aunt Jeff, who's very, very close to us this very day, and all the aunts were close. Aunt Jeff was always special. They were raised by their grandparents. And as they would walk to church, the 2 miles to church every week at Center Hill Church, they would walk up the hill, and it is up on a good-sized hill. You walk up off the highway to that little hill. And there's a little cemetery there, the Center Hill Cemetery. And that was the grave of her mom and dad were there. And every Sunday on their way to the church house, Grandma and Grandpa would walk the 2 little girls over to the gravesite and remind them, this is where your mom and dad are buried. Homer and Ludy Ford. Homer Ford was my grandfather. Homer Carl Ford. He was born in 1904 and died in 1936. And when they buried him, again, these white rocks are real common. And they covered his grave, surrounded his grave with those white rocks. And for years, everybody would just take care of them, rearrange them, keep them stacked neatly. When we mowed the cemetery, and I did that many times, and my brothers did it quite a bit, we would always make sure that those stones were clearly arranged. Well, as the years passed and we had moved away, and I don't know who was tending cemetery in those days, but those rocks began to disappear. And one day, this was the last rock on my grandfather's grave. The last one. So we decided we ought to keep it. And so I brought it home with me. That's the last rock on my grandfather's grave. Now listen, that's all I've got from my grandfather. Okay? I don't have any pocket knife, I don't have a gun, I don't have a piece of land, I don't have anything that ever came from my grandfather except for that rock. That rock wouldn't mean a thing in the world to you. That's a common old everyday chunking rock from Arkansas. But you know what? In my home, this rock is a special deal. Okay? Because it's our story. It reminds us of our story. We came from some tough situations. You ever think life is going tough? When I look at these rocks and get reminded of how tough my mother had it, my life ain't tough. I mean, it's kind of a piece of cake in comparison. All right? So having a reminder every once in a while of some other things in other people's lives are really important. Well, that rock means that to me. It says that to me. And that was the rock that came from Homer Carl Ford's grave. Well, his dad was Sam Ford. Sam Ford was born in 1882, right up on Cedar Creek, about 2 miles from the house where that was lived, about 4 miles from the Center Hill Church, up on Cedar Creek, a place where I used to go as a young boy and as a teenager. We would go swimming, fishing up on Cedar Creek, a big hole of water, and just off of that big hole of water had been the place where in 1882, Sam Ford was born. He moved about 2 miles down the road when he got married, built a cabin, a 4-room house, 4-room cabin with a fireplace in it. And he and Laura, Virginia, got married and began their family. They had 11 children. Before he passed away at the age of 76 in 1958. And before he passed away, he had buried 7 of those children. Okay? And so one of them being my grandfather. Homer, my grandfather, was his oldest son. Okay? Sam Ford's oldest son was my grandfather. Sam Ford's the one who took Mom and Aunt Jeff and raised them. 2 older girls went to live with other hands in the family house. Well, Sam Ford was a godly man. People far and wide knew him. He never owned an automobile. He never had running water in his house. He never had electricity. He never went very far. Never traveled probably out of the state of Arkansas. He would occasionally, maybe once a month, get to go to Hot Springs and eat at a restaurant in Hot Springs. And that was about Sunday, they walked that 2 miles to church at Center Hill Missionary Baptist Church. And they'd carry those two little girls. Now, Sam Ford was known as a singer. He was a bass singer. And the guys, young guys in the church would sit around like him because he could sight read, he could do the shape notes singing. And when they would start learning to sing bass, they got with Brother Sam to learn how to sing bass. He was the bass singer. And Sam Ford had that little cabin that he and Lauren, Virginia, had built when they got married, lived in it all their lives. I've spent some nights in it when we'd go out camping or hunting. We'd just go over there to that old cabin and we'd spend the night. And some cousins would do that every once in a while. And so I got to knock around that place quite a bit. It's where my mother was raised, and by the time that I was a teenager, nobody ever lived in it again. Grandpa and Grandma had passed away, and nobody ever lived in the old cabin. Eventually it was sold, and the land that they owned, some aunts, great aunts owned it, and they had sold it. I was sometime in my early 20s, in the early 70s, mid 70s. I went over there and they had begun to tear the old cabin down. And as they were tearing it down, they were dismantling, knocking down the old chimney. And this rock came out of that chimney. My great-grandfather dug that thing somewhere and stuck it up together and built a chimney. Raised all his kids. And my mom in that fireplace. That heated them. They cooked on it. The fireplace was the center of that cabin. It was everything. Well, I picked this rock up, brought it home. And I've had it ever since. It wouldn't mean anything to anybody else. My rock collection isn't that special. But you know what? These stones tell a story to me. These stones remind me of stuff. These stones remind me of where I came from. These memorial stones matter in my life. I sat down with my kids and told them these stories and tell them these stories. But these stories matter to me. These stories, I never knew any of my grandparents. Again, never inherited anything from any of my grandparents. None. That's it right there. Okay? But those things matter. And what I'm trying to say now, I'm trying to convey to you is that in your life as well, there are some important points and there are some important things and there are some great life lessons that you've learned somewhere along the way. And there are reminders along the way. And you need to make sure, especially we older folks, and I'm getting in that crowd, we need to especially make sure we pass some of that on to our children and our grandchildren and our grandchildren's children. We just need to make sure we start marking some stones. It would be easy not to have these and just chunk them and say, forget it, and what does it matter? But I can't do that. I got to try to pass some of the little bit of those memories along. I thought of a story that I've heard my mother tell before that kind of typifies Grandpa Oglesby. He was a farmer. They plowed by mules in those days. He always had a mule or two. He farmed for other people most of his life. 50 cents a day in the early days was a big wage. He eventually got to the time when he got $1 a day, and that was considered a lot of money. He just farmed. And around that old cabin, they had, smokehouse, and they had a potato house, and they had a little chicken house, and they lived off of that land completely. But when they were going to church, they'd always walk. And again, about 2 miles, old number 5 highway had been cut through there, but it was way back in the woods and the hills of those days. And Mama told the story about them walking to church one Sunday, and there was a large family that lived in the area by the name of Jameses, and there was a bunch of them, several different family groups of the Jameses. And one of them's name was Jesse James. He wasn't the Jesse James, but he was Jesse James. And he was neighbor. Lived on a neighboring piece of land. And Grandpa and Grandmother and those two little granddaughters were walking to church one Sunday. And Mr. Jesse James was down in the bottoms over there by Lockett Creek, plowing with his mule. And as they walked along, they were all shocked and surprised that on a Sunday, that Mr. James was out there plowing on Sunday. And my great-grandfather said, Jesse don't know it's Sunday. They didn't have televisions and radios. He just lost track of days and he didn't realize it was Sunday. And she said, Grandpa stepped off the road and headed off down across that field and walked way out there across the field where Mr. James was plowing with a mule. And said, Jesse, did you know it's Sunday? And he just dropped his head, took his mule, and headed to the barn. Wasn't going to be working on Sunday. That's the Lord's day. Isn't that amazing? You know why I tell these stories and keep those stones? It's because there was a lot of faith that my mother inherited, that I think got passed on down to us. You know Mom and Dad's story, and it was Mama's praying and Mama's witnessing and Mama's faith that brought my dad to Christ. Okay? And that came to me. An awful lot of that came from old Sam Ford and that little cabin back up those hills. That's part of my story. Now again, you have stories too. One of my real joys is to get people to maybe begin to tell their stories. Share with people about your faith. Now none of these guys are perfect. There's some things I don't tell in the whole story. None of them are perfect guys. Sam Ford was a good man. Everybody knew he was a good man. Homer Ford, his son, wasn't quite there. But he died at age 32. But it is a story about uniquely accurate. When the children come on, he said to the people of Israel, they ask you, what do these stones mean? You tell them about the goodness of God that got you across this river. I hope one of these days, some of the kids will say, tell me again the story about those rocks. Why do we keep them at the now? Those rocks are special to me. Let's pray. Father, I just pray that in all things in our lives, in our families, in our homes, we try to give Jesus all the glory we can. I just pray, Father, that the simplicity of these thoughts and this challenge, that will speak to our hearts. We've got to reach into the next generation. We've got to reach into the families of the next generation. And Father, some of it maybe would just be from telling the simple stories of our faith and how it is that we've come to be followers of Jesus and that He matters to us. And I pray, God, you'll remind us tonight to do that. And I ask it in Jesus' name. Our heads are bowed and our eyes are closed. And I hope that the story comes through to you. I really am concerned that we're losing the next generation. And I think part of it is they don't understand the story of faith in our lives. They don't understand how impactful it's been to us. We are what we are by the grace of God. Had it not been for God's grace and favor, by what the Lord's done for us, we wouldn't make it. We've got to pass that on to the next generation. It matters. It's important that we remind these kids about the memorial stones of our lives, the benchmarks, the important points, what really matters in life. We didn't do anything tonight but just pray for revival, pray for our families, pray for that next generation. We'd have a good service. Maybe you'll join me in praying that way. We stand together. Brother Ron will lead us in a song.